just caught me playing my didgeridoo. Often, on these long summer evenings, I'll put the didgeridoo between my lips and give it a good blow. Tonight's book is called Mr. Noisy by
Roger Hartling.
Tonight we will be attempting to read this in a Welsh accent. Hey, boy, read it. Oh, Mr. Noisy.
That's Irish.
Hey, doing it. Let's read the read boy. Tonight we'll be doing it in an Irish accent. Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading a story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. To be sure, to be sure.
To be sure, to be sure.
You can hear it over 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But hot to show, Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now, this story starts Mr. Noisy was asleep in the bed, in his bedroom, in his house, which was on top of the hill. He was snoring, and as you can well imagine when Mr. Noisy does, this is a snore worth hearing. To be sure, to be sure. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the whole bleeding world. It sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up. And so too did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is a town above the hill. To be sure, to be sure. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he'd go to shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! Bang! The door wobbled, the house wobbled, the whole bleeding hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high above, bejesus, wobbled. Now, then, Mr. Noisy walked up and down the hill. Clump, a clump, a clump. He walked into the baker's shop. Crash went to the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread, boomed Mr. Noisy. And Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife, Mrs. Crumb trembled and showed him a loaf of bread. It doesn't say whether the loaf was sliced. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. A clump, a clump, a clump. He walked into the butcher shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a piece of meat, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and showed him some meat. It doesn't specify what meat Mr. Noisy purchased at the butcher's run by Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon met in the street. We really must do something about that Mr. Noisy now being so noisy, to be sure, said Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Absolutely, replied Mr. Bacon, but what? I know, said Mrs. Crumb, and she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you have the answer. The following day, Mr. Noisy again went shopping down to Wobbletown. Clump, clump, a clump. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shops. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. I'm sorry, what did you say there, dear? Asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread, Mr. Noisy shouted. Sorry, said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. I cannot hear you, to be sure, to be sure. I'd like a loaf of bread, roared Mr. Noisy. Can't hear you, replied Mrs. Crumb. Oh, I think they're being very rude now. Mr. Noisy gave up and he went on. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, boomed Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. "I'd like a piece of meat," shouted Mr. Noisy. "Did you see something there, Mr. Noisy?" Mr. Bacon said. "I'd like a piece of meat." "Right, Mr. Noisy." "Pardon," said Mr. Bacon. "Oh, you see where they're going with this." Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. He went home. He was furious. You can tell, because look, he's walking furious there. He's so angry. He's got nothing in that basket. The old town has absolutely took the mick. The worm's laughing at him. The worm's laughing at him. He's saying, "Oh, you got to come up and stare now, Mr. Noisy. You got an empty basket." And he went to bed hungry. The day after, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went down to shops again. He's starving by now. He's had no bloody bread, no meat. Although he didn't specify what meat, did he? "Now, I'd like a loaf of bread," he bummed. "A what?" asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the very top of his voice. "I want a loaf of..." And then he stopped. And he thought. And then he said quietly, "I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb." Mrs. Crumb smiled. "Certainly," she said. You know what's happening. "Oh, it's lovely, that. I've gone a bit Midlands." Then Mr. Noisy went into the bacon shop. "Mr. Bacon shop, I'd like a piece of meat," he boomed. "Did you see something there?" said Mr. Bacon. "Yes, I did." "Oh," shouted Mr. Noisy. He's getting it now. To be sure. "I'd like a..." Then he stopped. And he thought. And then he said quietly, "I'd like a piece of your meat, please, Mr. Bacon." Mr. Bacon smiled. "My pleasure," he said. I just want to read that again. He said to Mr. Bacon, "I'd like a piece of your meat, please, Mr. Bacon." Mr. Bacon smiled and he said, "My pleasure." So that's the smile on Mr. Bacon's face after giving Mr. Noisy a piece of his meat. Okay, so carrying the bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off up home, up the hill, clump, clump, clumpity. He's walking on air now, look at him. Look at him, he's walking on air. Now, then he stopped, then he thought, and then, do you know what he did? He tiptoed. It was something Mr. Noisy had never tried before, and it was good fun, to be sure. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put out his hand to open the front door, then he stopped, and then he thought to himself, and then do you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly, and he stepped inside very quietly, and then he shut the door very gently. Quietly and gently were two things Mr. Noisy had never tried before, to be sure. And that was fun too. Mr. Noisy has now learned how to whisper. And I think that's a lovely story, and I think we can all learn a lovely lesson from that. For the next story, I'll be working on my Welsh boil. Ta-ta!